I'm Mrs. Hart. Would you dance with me? Just one dance? Aisha's voice, soft yet daring, hung in the air of the Hart mansion, where shadows clung to gilded walls. For a decade, Margaret Hart, the beloved grandmother of America's richest man, had been bound to a wheelchair, her legs silenced by a sinister crash. Aisha, a radiant young nurse, carried hope in her eyes and a past of her own scars. Her gentle touch and unyielding spirit stirred something long buried in Margaret's heart. A billionaire's empire, a hidden truth, and a dance that would shatter a decade of despair awaited. Stay to uncover how one woman's compassion upended a family's darkest secrets. If this moves you, hit subscribe, share where and when you're watching, and let's see how far this story takes us. The Hart Mansion loomed like a monument to forgotten dreams, its marble columns gleaming under the cold moonlight. Yet its halls whispered of secrets too heavy for light to touch. In the heart of New York's elite enclave, the estate was a world unto itself, sprawling gardens, crystal chandeliers, and walls adorned with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to judge the living. But beneath the opulence, a quiet decay festered. The air inside was thick, not with dust, but with the weight of a decade-long sorrow that clung to every velvet curtain and polished floorboard. Alexander Hart, at 35, was the undisputed titan of American wealth. His name commanded boardrooms, his decisions shaped markets, and his face, sharp-jawed, with piercing green eyes and dark hair swept back with disciplined precision, graced the covers of Forbes and Time. Yet as he stood in his penthouse office overlooking Manhattan's glittering skyline, his reflection in the glass betrayed a man hollowed by more than ambition. He was unmarried, untethered, pouring every ounce of himself into an empire that felt like both his crown and his cage. The Hart legacy was his to uphold, but it came at a cost, a family fractured by a tragedy no one spoke of, yet none could forget. 10 years ago, a car accident had stolen the legs of Margaret Hart, Alexander's grandmother, the woman who had raised him after his parents' early deaths. Margaret, at 78, had once been the soul of the Hart dynasty, a woman of fierce wit and boundless warmth, her laughter filling ballrooms, her steps commanding dance floors. She had taught Alexander to dream big, to fight for what mattered. But that night, a slick road, a screech of tires, and a crash orchestrated by an unseen hand had left her confined to a wheelchair, her spirit dimmed like a chandelier with half its bulbs extinguished. The doctors called it irreversible. Alexander had paid millions for specialists, flown them in from Zurich and Tokyo, but their polished words always ended the same: she'll never walk again. Margaret now lived in the east wing of the mansion, her world reduced to a series of rooms she could navigate without pain. Her white hair, once styled in elegant waves, now fell loosely over silk robes, and her eyes, though still sharp, carried a quiet grief. She was no longer the woman who had twirled through galas. She was a queen dethroned, her throne a prison of polished wood and leather. Yet she held her chin high, refusing to let despair claim her entirely. She spoke little of the accident, but late at night, when the house was still, Alexander would catch her staring out the window, her fingers tracing the armrests as if searching for the steps she'd lost. The accident was no accident, though no one dared say it aloud. Whispers of foul play had swirled in the aftermath. Brake lines tampered with, a driver who vanished, a police report too tidy to trust. Margaret had been the sole heir to the Hart fortune before Alexander came of age, and her will, rumored to hold secrets of its own, was a prize some would kill for. Alexander had his suspicions, but evidence was a ghost, slipping through his fingers like smoke. He buried himself in work, letting the empire's demands drown out the questions he couldn't answer. Then there was Evelyn, his stepmother, a woman whose beauty was as calculated as her smile. At 50, she moved through the mansion like a shadow in designer heels, her blonde hair immaculate, her sapphire earrings catching the light with every calculated turn. She had married Alexander's father just a year before his death, and her presence in the family felt like a storm that never broke. Evelyn was charming when it suited her voice honeyed as she spoke of family unity at charity galas. But Alexander knew better. Her eyes betrayed her, cold, always watching, always measuring. She managed the household with an iron grip, hiring staff, overseeing Margaret's care, and ensuring her influence was felt in every corner. To the world, she was the dutiful widow. To Alexander, she was a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Margaret's nurses came and went, each one vetted by Evelyn, each one leaving after months of her sharp critiques. Too slow, she'd say, or not professional enough. Alexander barely noticed, trusting Evelyn to handle the details while he closed deals worth billions. But Margaret's silence grew heavier with each departure, her eyes lingering on the ballroom she hadn't entered in a decade, where memories of waltzes and laughter now gathered dust. She never complained, but Alexander saw the toll it took. The way her hands trembled when she reached for her tea, the way her voice softened when she spoke of the past. He provided everything: doctors, equipment, comfort, but he couldn't give her what she craved most: freedom. Evelyn's latest hire was due to arrive that morning, a young nurse named Aisha Brooks. Alexander knew little about her, only that she was 25, highly recommended, and had a reputation for excellence. Evelyn had chosen her, which made Alexander wary, but he had no time to dwell on it. His phone buzzed with emails, his schedule packed with meetings. Yet as he left his office, a strange unease settled in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift, like the first crack in a frozen lake. In the mansion, the grandfather clock ticked relentlessly, its pendulum slicing through the silence. Margaret sat by her window, her gaze fixed on the gardens below, where roses bloomed in defiance of the coming autumn. She didn't know it yet, but the arrival of Aisha Brooks would be more than a new nurse. It would be the spark that could either illuminate the truth or burn the heart legacy to ash. The past, with its shadows and secrets, was stirring, and the mansion's gilded walls could no longer contain it. The morning sun filtered through the Hart Mansion's stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic patterns across the marble floors, but the warmth barely reached the east wing. Margaret Hart sat by her usual window, her silhouette framed against the velvet drapes, her fingers tracing the worn edge of a photograph. It was a faded image of her younger self, mid-twirl on a dance floor, her smile as bright as the chandelier above her. The memory felt like a taunt, a reminder of the life stolen 10 years ago. The house was silent, save for the faint clink of silverware from the dining room, where Evelyn orchestrated the day with her usual precision. But today, something new was coming. A nurse, Aisha Brooks, whose name carried no weight in the Hart family's gilded world, yet whose arrival would soon ripple through its foundations. Aisha stepped through the mansion's towering doors at precisely 9 o'clock, her footsteps soft but resolute on the polished floor. At 25, she was a vision of quiet strength, her dark skin radiant under the morning light, her long, wavy black hair cascading over her shoulders, and her eyes deep and searching, holding a warmth that belied her past. Orphaned young, raised by a grandmother whose love was fierce but fleeting, Aisha had learned to carry her own light through a world that often felt dim. Her scrubs were crisp, her posture unbowed by the mansion's grandeur, and in her hands she held a simple leather journal, a gift from her grandmother filled with notes on healing and hope. Evelyn greeted her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her voice smooth as silk but edged with control. "Miss Brooks, you'll find Mrs. Hart in the East Wing. She's particular. Follow my instructions precisely." Aisha nodded, her expression calm, but she caught the flicker of calculation in Evelyn's gaze. The stepmother's sapphire earrings glinted as she turned away, her heels clicking like a metronome, leaving Aisha to navigate the labyrinthine halls alone. The air grew heavier as she approached Margaret's room, as if the house itself held its breath. Margaret looked up as Aisha entered, her sharp eyes scanning the young woman with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Another nurse," she said, her voice dry but not unkind. "They never last long here." Aisha's lips curved into a gentle smile, undeterred. "I'm not here to last, ma'am. I'm here to help." She set her journal on the side table, its worn cover catching Margaret's attention. "What's that?" Margaret asked, her tone softer now, intrigued despite herself. Aisha's fingers brushed the leather. "Stories, lessons, things my grandmother taught me about never giving up." Margaret's gaze lingered on Aisha, as if seeing something she hadn't expected. A spark, a defiance that mirrored her own, long buried. The first day was a dance of small gestures. Aisha moved with purpose, adjusting Margaret's pillows, checking her chart, and asking questions that cut deeper than routine. "What was your favorite dance?" she asked while gently massaging Margaret's hands, her touch firm yet tender. Margaret hesitated, her eyes drifting to the photograph. "The waltz," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It felt like flying." Aisha nodded, her hands steady, her heart catching the weight of those words. She didn't push, didn't pry, but listened, letting Margaret's memories fill the silence. For the first time in years, Margaret felt seen, not as a patient, not as a relic, but as a woman with stories still worth telling. Evelyn, however, was less charmed. From the doorway, she watched Aisha with narrowed eyes, her fingers tightening around a glass of wine she held too early in the day. "Don't get too comfortable," she said later, cornering Aisha in the hallway. "This family doesn't need your enthusiasm." Aisha met her gaze, her voice steady. "I'm here for her, not you." The words were simple, but they carried a quiet fire, and Evelyn's smile faltered, if only for a moment. She turned away, but the air crackled with her unspoken threat. Aisha felt the weight of it, but pressed on, her resolve unshaken. She had faced worse than cold stares in her life: orphanages, loss, the ache of being unwanted. And she wouldn't falter now. Alexander, meanwhile, was a ghost in his own home. His presence felt more in the hum of his phone than in person. He glimpsed Aisha briefly as he passed through the foyer, his eyes catching on her poised figure before a call pulled him away. She was different, he thought fleetingly, not cowed by the mansion's weight, not intimidated by Evelyn's shadow. But his mind was a storm of contracts and deadlines, leaving no room for curiosity. Not yet. He didn't know that Aisha's arrival was the first thread in a tapestry that would unravel his world. By evening, Aisha sat with Margaret again, sharing a story of her grandmother's garden, where roses bloomed despite cracked soil. Margaret listened, her hands still, her eyes softer than they'd been in years. "You remind me of someone," she said quietly. "Someone who didn't let the world break her." Aisha smiled, her heart swelling. "Maybe we're both a little like that." Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the room in gold, and for a moment the east wing felt less like a cage. Aisha's presence was a light, small but persistent, piercing the darkness that had settled over the Hart family for a decade. But light cast shadows, and in those shadows, Evelyn watched, her plans already forming, her secrets coiled like a snake ready to strike. The Hart Mansion's east wing, once a mausoleum of memories, began to hum with a new rhythm. Aisha Brooks, with her steady hands and unyielding spirit, had planted a seed in Margaret's heart, though neither fully grasped its potential. The morning light filtered through heavy drapes, catching the dust motes that danced around Margaret's wheelchair. Aisha knelt beside her, her dark eyes bright with purpose. A tray of medical supplies replaced by a simple notebook filled with exercises she'd sketched out late into the night. "Let's try something today," she said, her voice a blend of encouragement and challenge. Margaret's lips tightened, her hands gripping the armrests, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity, a spark that hadn't burned in years. Aisha had noticed it the day before, a faint twitch in Margaret's left foot when she'd massaged her calf. A movement so slight it could have been a trick of the light, but Aisha, trained to see what others missed, knew better. She'd spent years studying the body's resilience, driven by her grandmother's mantra: "The heart keeps fighting long after the body gives up." Margaret's chart was a litany of grim prognoses: nerve damage, atrophy, irreversible. But Aisha saw possibility where others saw finality. She began with gentle stretches, guiding Margaret's legs through small arcs, her hands firm yet careful, coaxing muscles that had lain dormant for a decade. "Breathe with me," Aisha said softly, her voice a lifeline. Margaret exhaled, her body tense, her mind wrestling with doubt. The exercises were grueling, not because of their intensity, but because of the weight they carried. Each movement was a battle against 10 years of despair, each wince a reminder of the accident that had stolen Margaret's freedom. "This is pointless," Margaret snapped after a failed attempt to lift her foot, her voice sharp but trembling. Aisha didn't flinch. "Pointless is giving up before you've even tried," she replied, her tone steady, her hands still working. Margaret's eyes flashed, but she didn't protest further. Something in Aisha's resolve, her refusal to treat Margaret as fragile, stirred a memory of the woman she used to be. The one who'd faced down boardrooms and danced through storms. Downstairs, Evelyn prowled the mansion like a predator, scenting change. She'd caught the faint sounds of Aisha's sessions, soft encouragements, the creak of the wheelchair, Margaret's occasional sharp retorts, and her unease grew. From her study, where she pored over legal documents tied to the Hart estate, Evelyn's fingers tapped restlessly. The will, locked in a safe only she and Margaret knew about, was her obsession. 10 years ago, she'd ensured Margaret's accident would shift the family's power, but Aisha's presence threatened to unravel her carefully woven plans. "She's just a nurse," Evelyn muttered to herself, but the words felt hollow. She summoned Aisha that afternoon, her voice dripping with false warmth. "You're doing well, Miss Brooks, but don't overstep. Mrs. Hart needs rest, not experiments." Aisha's smile was polite, but her eyes held a quiet defiance. "I'm following her lead, not yours," she said, and walked away, leaving Evelyn's composure fraying at the edges. Alexander, meanwhile, was a shadow passing through the mansion, his days consumed by boardroom battles and late-night calls. Yet Aisha's presence began to pierce his armor. He'd caught glimpses of her, carrying trays with care, speaking to Margaret with a warmth that felt foreign in these cold halls. One evening, as he paused in the foyer, he overheard Aisha's laughter, light and unguarded, mingling with Margaret's softer chuckle. It stopped him cold. He couldn't recall the last time he'd heard his grandmother laugh. Curious, he lingered outside the east wing, watching through a half-open door as Aisha guided Margaret's hand through a gentle exercise, their heads bent close, sharing a story about a garden Aisha's grandmother once tended. Alexander's chest tightened. For a moment, he saw not just a nurse, but a woman whose strength seemed to hold the room together. Margaret felt it too. Aisha's stories, of her childhood in a cramped apartment, of her grandmother's roses blooming against all odds, wove a thread of connection between them. One afternoon, as Aisha worked on Margaret's legs, Margaret spoke of the accident for the first time. "It wasn't just chance," she whispered, her voice raw. "I felt it, even then. Someone wanted me gone." Aisha's hands paused, her heart clenching, but she didn't press. Instead, she met Margaret's gaze. "You're still here," she said firmly, "and that's what matters." The words were simple, but they lit a fire in Margaret's chest, a flame of hope she thought had died long ago. By the week's end, Margaret's toes twitched again, deliberate this time, and Aisha's eyes shone with triumph. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice bright. Margaret stared at her foot, her breath catching. I felt it," she murmured, her voice trembling with disbelief. Tears welled, not from pain, but from a feeling she'd forgotten. Possibility. Aisha squeezed her hand, her own eyes glistening. "This is just the start," she said. Outside, the mansion's clocks ticked on, but in that room, time seemed to pause, holding its breath for what was to come. Evelyn, watching from the shadows, felt the ground shift beneath her. Aisha wasn't just a nurse, she was a threat, and Evelyn would not let her light burn unchecked. The Hart Mansion's east wing had begun to pulse with a fragile hope, but its shadows grew darker, as if recoiling from Aisha Brooks's quiet radiance. The late September light slanted through tall windows, bathing Margaret's room in a golden haze, yet an undercurrent of unease lingered. Aisha knelt beside Margaret's wheelchair, her hands guiding the older woman's legs through careful stretches, her voice a soft cadence of encouragement. "One more, just like that," she murmured, her wavy black hair catching the light as she worked. Margaret's face, etched with lines of pain and pride, softened with each small victory. A toe that curled, a knee that bent a fraction higher. But beyond the room's heavy oak door, the mansion held its breath, guarding secrets that threatened to unravel the fragile progress within. Aisha's discovery came by chance, tucked away in a moment of routine. While tidying Margaret's bedside table, her fingers brushed against a loose panel in the drawer, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a yellowed envelope, its edges frayed, sealed with wax that bore the Hart family crest. Her heart quickened as she turned it over, seeing no name, only a date scrawled in faded ink. The day of Margaret's accident, 10 years prior. Aisha hesitated, her instincts warring with her duty. She glanced at Margaret, who was gazing out the window, lost in thought, and slipped the envelope into her journal. Whatever it held, it wasn't safe to open here. Not yet. Evelyn's presence loomed larger that week, her shadow falling across every interaction. She'd taken to lingering near the east wing, her sapphire earrings glinting like warning signals. "You're pushing her too hard, Miss Brooks," she said one morning, her voice smooth but laced with venom, as she caught Aisha adjusting Margaret's leg brace. "She's not your experiment." Aisha's eyes met hers unflinching. "She's not anyone's experiment. She's fighting and I'm helping her." Evelyn's smile was a blade, sharp and cold. "Careful, dear. This family doesn't take kindly to overreach." The threat hung in the air, but Aisha held her ground, her heart pounding with a mix of defiance and fear. She knew Evelyn was more than a controlling stepmother. Her instincts screamed it, and the envelope burned in her mind. Margaret sensed the tension but said nothing, her trust in Aisha deepening with each session. The exercises grew more ambitious. Small weight shifts, assisted stands that left Margaret trembling but exhilarated. One afternoon, as Aisha steadied her, Margaret gripped her hand, her voice low. "I dream of walking again, Aisha. Not just moving, walking into that ballroom like I used to." Her eyes, sharp with memory, glistened. Aisha squeezed her hand, her throat tight. "We'll get there, step by step." The words were a promise, but the envelope's weight pressed against Aisha's thoughts, a reminder that the past held answers neither could ignore. Alexander, caught in the whirlwind of his empire, began to notice Aisha's impact. He'd returned home late one evening, his tie loosened, his green eyes heavy with exhaustion. Passing the east wing, he paused, drawn by the sound of Aisha's voice, recounting a story of her grandmother's resilience through a harsh winter. Margaret's soft laugh followed, a sound so rare it pierced Alexander's guarded heart. He lingered unseen, watching Aisha's gentle strength, her radiant skin glowing under the lamplight. She was different, not just a nurse, but a force, stirring something in him he'd long buried. He stepped away, his mind racing, unaware that his growing curiosity was pulling him into a storm he couldn't yet see. Evelyn's suspicions hardened into action. She rifled through Margaret's room when Aisha was elsewhere, her fingers trembling as she searched for anything that could betray her. The missing envelope didn't escape her notice. She'd known of its existence, hidden by Margaret years ago, but never its contents. Her pulse quickened, her mind racing to Aisha. "She's meddling," Evelyn hissed to herself, her reflection in a gilded mirror showing a woman unraveling. She cornered Aisha later, her voice low and dangerous. "You're here to care for her, not dig into things that don't concern you." Aisha's heart thudded, but her face remained calm. "I'm doing my job," she said, her voice steady despite the chill of Evelyn's gaze. The confrontation ended, but the air crackled with unspoken threats. That night, Aisha sat alone in her small room on the mansion's upper floor, the envelope heavy in her hands. She broke the seal, her breath catching as she read, a mechanic's report, buried by bribes, hinting at tampered brakes, and a note in Margaret's handwriting. Evelyn knew. The words were a spark in a powder keg, confirming Aisha's fears. She hid the envelope again, her mind racing. Telling Margaret now could shatter her fragile progress. Telling Alexander risked everything. But silence wasn't an option. She'd seen too much pain to let the truth fester. As the mansion slept, Aisha stood by her window, the city's distant lights a faint comfort. She thought of her grandmother, whose strength had carried her through loss, and felt a resolve harden within her. Margaret's fight was hers now, and the shadows of the past were no match for the light she carried. But Evelyn was watching, her plans coiling tighter, and the truth, once loose, would burn through the Hart family like wildfire. The Hart mansion's east wing, once a silent crypt, now thrummed with a pulse of defiance. Aisha Brooks stood before Margaret Hart, her hands steady as she adjusted a makeshift brace on the older woman's leg. The room, bathed in the soft glow of a late October afternoon, held an air of anticipation, as if the walls themselves leaned in to witness what might unfold. Aisha's dark eyes shone with determination, her wavy hair tucked behind her ears, revealing a face etched with both hope and resolve. Margaret, her white hair catching the light like a crown, gripped her wheelchair's armrests, her breath uneven. The exercises had grown bolder, each session a step closer to the impossible. But the weight of 10 years in a wheelchair pressed against them both, a silent dare to fail. Aisha's discovery of the envelope, its cryptic note and damning mechanics report, burned in her mind, but she kept it hidden, locked in her journal. The truth about Evelyn's role in Margaret's accident was a storm she wasn't ready to unleash, not when Margaret's spirit was finally stirring. Instead, Aisha poured her energy into the exercises, her hands guiding Margaret's legs through movements that grew stronger each day. "Focus on your toes," Aisha said, her voice a calm anchor. "Feel them, move them." Margaret's brow furrowed, her face a map of pain and effort. But then it happened. A deliberate curl of her toes, faint but undeniable. The room seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's eyes widened, her voice a whisper. "Did I?" Aisha's smile broke like dawn. "You did." The moment was electric, a spark that lit a fire in Margaret's chest. Tears welled, not from sorrow but from a feeling she thought had died, a flicker of control over a body that had betrayed her. Aisha knelt closer, her hands steadying Margaret's trembling leg. "That's your strength, not mine," she said, her voice thick with pride. Margaret's laugh was brittle but alive, a sound that echoed through the east wing like a forgotten melody. They pressed on, Aisha coaxing small lifts, tiny shifts of weight, each movement a rebellion against a decade of stillness. Margaret's hands shook, her breath ragged, but her eyes burned with a fire Aisha recognized, the will to fight. Evelyn's shadow loomed larger, her suspicion now a palpable threat. She'd noticed the change in Margaret, her brighter eyes, her softer smiles, and it unnerved her. From the dining room, where she sipped coffee with calculated calm, Evelyn's gaze darted to the east wing's closed door. The will still locked in her safe was her prize, but Margaret's progress was a crack in her carefully built empire. She confronted Aisha that evening in the hallway, her voice low and venomous. "You're filling her head with delusions," she hissed, her sapphire earrings glinting like daggers. "Stop these games or you'll regret it." Aisha's heart raced, but her face remained a mask of composure. "I'm giving her what you never did. Hope," she said, her words sharp enough to cut. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but Aisha turned away, her resolve a shield against the storm brewing in the stepmother's heart. Alexander, meanwhile, was no longer a mere ghost in the mansion. The sound of Margaret's laughter, rare and precious, had begun to pull him from his world of contracts and power plays. One afternoon, he lingered outside the east wing, drawn by Aisha's voice, steady and warm, guiding Margaret through an exercise. He peered through the door unseen and saw Aisha supporting Margaret's frail frame as she attempted to shift her weight. The sight struck him like a thunderbolt. His grandmother, once a titan, now trembling but fighting, and Aisha, her radiant strength a beacon in the room. Alexander's green eyes softened, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. Aisha wasn't just a nurse. She was rewriting a story he'd thought was finished. He stepped away, his mind alight with her presence, unaware of how deeply she was shifting his world. Margaret's progress wasn't without pain. Each session left her aching, her muscles protesting the strain. But Aisha's patience was unwavering. "You're stronger than you know," she told Margaret one evening, as they rested by the window, the city's lights twinkling beyond the glass. Margaret's hand found Aisha's, her grip surprisingly firm. "You're the daughter I never had," she said, her voice breaking. Aisha's throat tightened, her own losses, her parents, her grandmother, echoing in the moment. "Then let's keep fighting together," she replied, her eyes glistening. The bond between them was a lifeline, fragile but unbreakable, a light that no shadow could extinguish. Evelyn, however, was plotting. Late that night in her study, she pored over old documents, her fingers trembling as she realized the envelope was missing. Her heart pounded. She'd hidden it years ago, a safeguard against Margaret's suspicions, but now it was gone. Aisha's face flashed in her mind, and her fear hardened into resolve. She would not let a nurse undo a decade of control. The mansion's clocks ticked on, their rhythm a countdown to a confrontation none could avoid. Aisha, clutching her journal, felt the weight of the truth she carried, knowing each step Margaret took brought them closer to a reckoning. The Hart mansion shimmered under a rare November warmth, its chandeliers casting prisms across the grand foyer as preparations for Margaret Hart's 79th birthday stirred the air. The staff bustled, arranging roses and polishing silver under Evelyn's watchful eye, her smile a mask of festivity that hid her growing panic. Aisha Brooks, her presence now a quiet force in the East Wing, had pushed Margaret further than anyone dared dream, each small movement a crack in the decade-long prison of her wheelchair. But the envelope Aisha carried, its secrets of tampered brakes and Evelyn's betrayal, loomed like a storm cloud, its weight heavy in her journal as she prepared for the day. The mansion, with its gilded walls and silent clocks, felt poised on the edge of something momentous, as if the very stones knew a reckoning was near. Alexander Hart, for once, had cleared his schedule. The billionaire, whose life was a tapestry of boardroom conquests, felt an unfamiliar pull to be home. Margaret's birthday was a quiet affair by Hart's standards, but this year he wanted it different. Personal, a gesture to bridge the distance that had grown between them. He'd planned to surprise her, arriving early with a gift, a locket engraved with a rose, a nod to the garden she loved before the accident stole her steps. As his car wound through the estate's gates, his green eyes scanned the familiar spires, a rare softness in them. Aisha's face flickered in his mind, her radiant strength, her laughter weaving through the mansion's cold halls. He didn't know why she lingered in his thoughts, but he felt her light drawing him closer. In the East Wing, Aisha and Margaret worked in secret, their sessions now a sacred ritual. The room was warm, the curtains drawn back to let the sunlight flood in, illuminating Margaret's determined face. Aisha had crafted a plan for today, not just exercises, but a bold leap. "Let's try standing," she said, her voice steady but laced with excitement. Margaret's breath caught, her hands trembling on the armrests. "I'll fall," she whispered, fear flickering in her eyes. Aisha knelt, her dark gaze unwavering. "I won't let you." With careful hands, she guided Margaret to the edge of the wheelchair, supporting her frail frame. Margaret's legs shook, her knuckles white, but Aisha's strength was a pillar. "One step," Aisha urged, her voice a beacon. Margaret's foot lifted, trembling, and planted itself on the carpet, a miracle in motion. The moment broke something open in Margaret. Tears streamed down her lined cheeks, her laugh a fragile, joyous sound. "I'm doing it," she gasped, her voice trembling with disbelief. Aisha's eyes shone, her own heart pounding. "You're more than doing it. You're alive." The air hummed with their shared triumph, and then Aisha, caught in the moment, made a daring suggestion. "Let's dance just a little." Margaret's eyes widened, but a spark of her old fire flared. She nodded, and Aisha, with infinite care, guided her into a slow sway, their hands clasped tightly. Margaret's satin robe swayed, her slippers whispering against the floor as they moved. Clumsy but alive, a waltz born from 10 years of stillness. The room seemed to glow, the past retreating in the face of this fragile, defiant dance. Alexander, stepping into the mansion earlier than planned, heard the faint strains of music, a soft melody Aisha had played to set the mood. His heart quickened as he climbed the stairs drawn to the East Wing. He pushed open the door, and the sight stopped him cold. There in the golden light was his grandmother, standing, moving, dancing. Aisha's strong arms supported her, her face radiant with pride, her wavy hair catching the sun as they swayed. Margaret's eyes were alight, her smile a glimpse of the woman who'd once twirled through ballrooms. Alexander's breath caught, his hand gripping the doorframe. "Mother," he whispered, his voice cracking, though Margaret wasn't his mother but his heart's anchor. The words slipped out, raw and reverent, as tears blurred his vision. Margaret faltered at his voice, fear flashing across her face, as if his gaze might tether her back to the wheelchair. But Aisha's hand tightened, grounding her. "You're doing this," she whispered fiercely. Margaret straightened, her trembling legs finding strength, her chin lifting with a defiance Alexander hadn't seen in a decade. "Alexander," she said, her voice breathless but firm, "I told you I was buried alive. Look at me now." The words struck him like lightning, his chest heaving with awe. Aisha's eyes met his, her expression a mix of triumph and vulnerability, and in that moment he saw her, not just as the nurse who'd wrought a miracle, but as a woman who'd rewritten his family story. Evelyn, alerted by a servant's whisper, appeared in the doorway, her face paling as she saw Margaret standing. Her carefully crafted mask slipped, her eyes darting to Aisha with a venom that betrayed her fear. The dance, fragile yet powerful, was a threat to everything she'd built. Alexander's gaze shifted to her, a flicker of suspicion igniting. The mansion's clocks ticked louder, as if counting down to the truth. Aisha, holding Margaret steady, felt the weight of the envelope in her mind, knowing this moment was only the beginning. The dance had set something free, but the shadows were closing in, and the Hart family's secrets were about to ignite. The Hart mansion, bathed in the soft glow of November dusk, stood as if holding its breath, the air charged with the aftershocks of Margaret's dance. The East Wing, once a tomb of memories, now pulsed with a fragile triumph, but the shadows of the past were not yet banished. Isha Brooks stood beside Margaret, her hands still warm from their clasped embrace, her dark eyes catching the lamplight as she steadied the older woman's trembling frame. Margaret's face, radiant with a defiance that had slumbered for a decade, held a new resolve. Alexander Hart, his green eyes still wet with disbelief, lingered in the doorway, the sight of his grandmother standing, dancing, etched into his soul. But Evelyn's presence, a venomous shadow in the corridor, signaled that the truth, like a caged beast, was about to break free. Margaret's voice, steady despite her exertion, cut through the silence. "Aisha, help me sit," she said, her tone carrying the weight of a queen reclaiming her throne. Aisha guided her back to the wheelchair, her touch gentle but firm, her heart pounding with the knowledge of the envelope hidden in her journal. The mechanic's report and Margaret's scrawled note, Evelyn knew, burned in her mind, a truth too dangerous to hold alone. Alexander stepped forward, his voice low. "Grandmother, how is this possible?" Margaret's eyes met his, fierce and unyielding. "Because Aisha saw me when no one else did," she said, her gaze flickering to Evelyn, who stood rigid, her face a mask of barely contained panic. Aisha took a breath, her resolve hardening. "There's something you both need to know," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. She retrieved the envelope from her journal, its frayed edges trembling in her hands. "I found this in your room," she told Margaret, her eyes steady. "It's about the accident." Margaret's breath hitched, her hands gripping the armrests, while Alexander's brow furrowed, his instincts sharpening. Evelyn's voice sliced through, sharp and desperate. "That's nonsense. She's lying, stirring trouble." But her protest faltered as Aisha opened the envelope, revealing the mechanic's report, tampered brakes, a hushed payment, and Margaret's note, its words a quiet accusation. The room stilled, the air thick with the weight of a decade's betrayal. Margaret's eyes locked on Evelyn, her voice cold as steel. "You knew," she said, each word a hammer strike. "You let me rot in this chair thinking it was fate." Evelyn's composure shattered, her hands trembling as she backed toward the door. "You're delusional," she spat, but her eyes betrayed her, wide, cornered, like a predator caught in a trap. Alexander stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Enough. I'm calling in a team to investigate. If this is true, Evelyn, you're finished." He pulled out his phone, his fingers swift, his empire's resources now a weapon against the woman who'd poisoned his family. Aisha stood by Margaret, her presence a quiet anchor as the older woman faced her betrayer. "I trusted you," Margaret said, her voice breaking but resolute. "You took my legs, my freedom, for a fortune that was never yours." Evelyn's face twisted, her desperation spilling over. "You were in the way," she hissed, the confession slipping out before she could stop it. "The will, the estate, it should have been mine." The words hung like poison, and Alexander's jaw clenched, his suspicion now certainty. He signaled to the staff, who'd gathered silently, to ensure Evelyn didn't leave. The truth, raw and jagged, had torn through the mansion's gilded facade. As Evelyn was led away, her protests fading down the corridor, Margaret reached for Aisha's hand, her grip fierce. "You gave me back my life," she whispered, tears streaming down her lined cheeks. Aisha's eyes glistened, her own heart full. "You were always alive," she said softly. "You just needed to remember." Alexander watched, his chest tight with gratitude and something deeper, a pull toward Aisha that he could no longer ignore. He stepped closer, his voice soft. "Miss Brooks." "Aisha," he began, his usual polish giving way to raw sincerity. "You've done what no one else could. Stay, please. Not as a nurse, but as family." Aisha's breath caught, her heart racing as she saw the warmth in his eyes, a promise of something new. Margaret, her spirit alight, broke the moment with a trembling laugh. "I want a ball," she declared, her voice vibrant. "A real one, in the ballroom, like before. I'll walk in, Aisha, with you beside me." Aisha smiled, her throat tight, and nodded. "We'll dance again," she said, the words a vow. Alexander's gaze lingered on Aisha, his heart opening to a future he hadn't dared imagine. A life with her, with Margaret, free from the shadows. The mansion's clocks ticked on, but their rhythm was no longer a countdown to despair. Evelyn faced justice, her schemes unraveled by the truth Aisha had uncovered. Margaret, though still needing time to fully walk, began planning her ball, her spirit soaring. Aisha, once an orphan seeking a home, found one in the Hart family, her light forever bound to theirs. And Alexander, the billionaire who'd built walls around his heart, saw in Aisha a love that could rebuild his world. The Hart mansion, once a cage of secrets, stood ready to shine again, its halls alive with the promise of freedom. What a journey we've shared through the Hart mansion's shadows and triumphs. Aisha's courage, Margaret's resilience, and Alexander's awakening remind us that light can pierce even the darkest secrets. We hope this tale of hope and justice touched your heart. Please share your thoughts in the comments. What moved you most? Where and when are you joining us? Whether it's a quiet evening in August 2025 or beyond. Your voice matters and we'd love to hear it. Thank you for being part of this story. Your support keeps us storytelling. Hit subscribe, share the love, and stay tuned for more tales that stir the soul. Until next time, keep shining.